Thank you for that introduction. And I appreciate you guys joining us for a session that we've been referring to as the modern business process. I'm going to go ahead and apologize ahead of time for any background noise you might hear. I know everyone's working from home nowadays, and this is my home. It is filled with background noise. So, again, I apologize. But, again, I appreciate you guys joining us for this session. And more specifically, I've been thinking about that name, the modern business process. And while I'm the one who came up with that name, I think it's kind of vague. There are a lot of things that can make a business process modern, or anything modern, but I want to dig specifically into how we looked at a business process in New York Life, how we pulled it out of the era in which it was born and put it back down in the era in which we live, making it more appropriate for that. I'm hoping that after this session, you'll feel a little bit more emboldened to go back to your businesses, identify opportunities for modernization, identify what barriers exist for modernization, and figure out how you can get around those using a few functional processes, OutSystems, and a concept that we've been referring to as digital enablement. So before we go too much further, I want to talk about who you're going to be hearing from today. So later you're going to hear from Phil Sabo, who is the head of insurance solution IT at New York Life. Phil has been doing data and digital modernizations for upwards of 20 years now, so he knows a bit about what he's talking about. My name is Dane Sauceda. I am the manager and solutions architect on this project. Phil has been leading us through the whole thing. So a little bit more scene setting as to where we come from. Phil comes from New York Life, which I'm sure many of you have heard from. They are one of the world's largest life and long-term care insurance providers, and they've been around for about 175 years. Any company that's that big and has been around for that long of a time has plenty of opportunity for modernization, and that process of modernizing has to be refined to be quicker and more efficient over time. And OutSystems has been a great tool for that. So Phil and New York Life have been a next step for OutSystems last year when they won their first innovation award. And they're just continuing to grow that partnership over time. So I come from SenseCorp, which is an American consulting firm that specializes in data and digital modernization across all different types of industries. We've done data warehousing, application development, reporting visualization, data science, you name it. That's kind of our bread and butter. So we've been partners with OutSystems since 2013, and we understand the value that it provides our clients. And we've won a couple of innovation awards ourselves, and New York Life and SenseCorp are hoping to take home a third one for us this year. So I'm excited to show you what we got, but I'm going to pass it off to Phil to talk about our first section of content, talking about New York Life, OutSystems, and the work we've done so far. Phil?
Thanks, Dane, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Wanted to take a couple seconds to introduce App Central. App Central is a web and mobile enablement tool that we created for our sales force, and not just our sales force, but also support staff such as product consultants, territory managers, geo staff, agent staff, and the like. And it's a suite of tools that we've introduced over the last 2 years. And I want to talk a little bit through some of those applications, give you some background. So we began kind of this initiative back in mid 2018, where we engaged with OutSystems. Our first application, our first foray into kind of this digital enablement was with a tool that we called Policy App Tracker. Policy App Tracker gives a line of sight and visibility to our agents through the pipeline from app submission all the way through to decision, for a various policy. And it gives them all the statuses, when it's reached certain thresholds within the process. It also provides alerts if things are running long. And the goal was really to reduce calls to the case manager or the call center and provide more insight for that. Since then, we've expanded the application. We have several other tools that make up the suite, such as an expense allowance monitoring. And that gives, now expense allowance isn't kind of what most people would think about it. It's an additional compensation based off a first year commission, and there are tiers. And it gives them transparency into where they stand at any given point in time, so they can see, I'm one policy sold away from meeting my next threshold. So it was kind of a way of providing more insight to their compensation model as well. We're also working on a commissions application. Policy alerts was a big one, or agent alerts. So this provides the agents transparency within the application to see different types of alerts. We have policy alerts, operational alerts, and claims alerts with push notification through OneSignal. And it also enables the agent to subscribe into the types of alerts that they want to receive on a daily basis. We've also created applications for their LTC Elite status, and that was kind of our foray into gamifying the application. We wanted to drive more user adoption. So, between what we've done with expense allowance and the LTC Elite status, it's really driven a lot more adoption into it. So they really do get everything they want in a single place. We also have some other apps. Dane's going to talk through Prescreen here in a couple of minutes. But we also have things like license and appointment, and it gives them transparency into where they're able to sell, as well as their training certifications, and we can provide the agent with push notifications to their mobile device with, hey, I'm 60, 90, 30 days out from needing to re-up my certification. So we hope you guys get a good feel for what we've done here. It's really been a great journey, and with kind of Sense Corp helping guide us through this, as well as tremendous engagement from our agents and our product consultants, we've really driven a lot of functionality into the tool. Dane?
Thanks, Phil. So I want to talk about a concept called digital enablement. This is the process by which OutSystems changes the way that we do business. And there are four parts to that. In the top left, it starts with a low barrier to entry and time to market. It means that it costs less and takes less time to develop something in OutSystems versus its competitors. It allows us to be bolder with the risks that we take. In the top right, it gives us a sense of creativity and innovation. It allows us to embolden and maximize the potential of our best and our brightest by taking their best ideas and bringing them to fruition because we're able to take bolder risks. It also gives us a sense of agility and flexibility at the bottom left, where based on the demands of the business, when there's a rapid response that is necessary, we are able to respond in a matter of hours or days rather than weeks or months within competing tools or custom development. It changes the way that we can respond and interact with our users. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is the concept of being able to develop something that pays for itself. It means that we can have a specific eye towards increasing revenues or decreasing costs with the tools that we're developing in such a way that it offsets the cost of development of the tool. This is something that we did with the business process we're talking about today. And it makes it much easier to justify to your leadership about the decisions that you're making if they know that there's a strong ROI involved. So we took the concept of digital enablement and we applied it to a specific business process called prescreening. So prescreening is the process by which an agent will assess the potential insurability of a client. If underwriting in the insurance business is the process by which we determine if we can and at what rate we would insure someone who's applying for a policy, prescreening is the process by which we simulate underwriting to give the client expectations of what might happen during underwriting and potentially filter out those that might not be approved for a policy. And as of right now, prescreening is done via an 80-page underwriting guide or a prescreening guide. This is something that lists out all the information necessary in order to assess the insurability of a client. And this is a highly complex process. It requires us to understand, basic demographic information like the gender, height, weight, state that they're filing in, the age of the potential insured, and what medications they have, what conditions they have, a million contextual questions about those medications and conditions that make up that 80-page document. And it ends up resulting in a system of debit points, where if you reach a certain amount of debit points, then you would be declined. And this process is pretty arduous. Going through an 80-page underwriting guide is not particularly accessible. And what we found is that agents just weren't doing it. As I mentioned, it wasn't accessible. It takes too long to get a prescreen out the door. If it takes you 45 minutes to actually come to a good, accurate understanding of their insurability, you'd rather just not do it or waste the agent's time or the client's time. And so what we wanted to do is decrease that barrier to entry, make it more accessible. So our idea was to create a web and mobile application in which an agent could run through only the questions that are necessary to ask their specific client. in a matter of 3 to 5 minutes rather than 45 minutes, right? So that they could do this for every policy application that they submit. The reason why we want to do that is because every application that is submitted, regardless if it's approved or denied, it'll cost us about $3,000 in underwriting costs. And that means at the scale in which New York Life is doing this, if we can decrease the decline rate by 1%, then we could pay for the cost of the development of the application. If we can decrease it by 10%, we can save New York Life upwards of $1 million over the course of a year in perpetuity, meaning that there's a massive incentive for us to revamp this process. So how did we do that? How did we breathe new life into this old business process? And that started with that 80-page underwriting guide. Page by page, we went with the subject matter experts looking for proprietary knowledge or edge cases, trying to understand every piece of information necessary to assess the insurability of a client. And once we had all the information that was necessary, we needed to design questions to gather that information, categories of questions, and we needed a logical flow through which we could ask those questions. There are about 1,200 different questions that we ended up designing to address every piece of information that could be necessary. These 1,200 questions could result in about 800 different scenarios that would affect someone's insurability. So when we had all of the questions designed and we created a logical flow through which we could ask them, we created wireframes, part of the user experience design process where we ideated what we imagined those screens would look like to gather that information. And once we had everything that we needed, we broke all of that information down into data, metadata specifically, where each question was a record in its own table. Each answer was a record in its own table. Each scenario was a record in its own table. And we could figure out what combinations of answers resulted in what scenarios. So this is our data model. On the right, you'll see a close-up of what is essentially the engine of the application, what helps us determine, based on what answers you provided, what is the next question we need to ask you. This helps us only ask the questions that are necessary. And it helps us understand at any point during the assessment what scenarios have accrued. How close are they to being denied? Or how do we imagine explaining why someone would be declined or get what result they did at the end of the assessment? This engine allows us to create a really, really specific assessment of their insurability so that even after it's done, even if after they've been declined, they could make changes and they know exactly what changes they would need to make in order to be approved next time. So this engine, this metadata-driven solution, is pretty key to being able to create a solution that doesn't require a lot of human intervention, that automates the whole process. Next, I want to talk about the process of experience design. So on the left, you'll see wireframes for how we ideated what this application might look like. And on the right, you'll see several iterations later when we came to a final conclusion as to what we wanted that interface to look like. We needed an interface that required very little training to be able to understand, something that was intuitive, so that they could use it and they would want to use it every time they submitted an application. And so we didn't need it to be clunky. We wanted it to look new. We needed them to be able to understand this highly complex process through an interface that guided them easily through the process. And SenseCorp has an internal experience design team that helps us to design these from the bottom up specifically for usability, and so that people will want to use them. This process, creating a good interface, is a completely often underrated process that I think you have to do if you want a successful process or a successful product. Experience design is something that was extremely valuable to our project. And lastly, I want to talk about the process by which we measured our progress after releasing the tool. Because OutSystems allows us to do a lot of custom development, we could create a custom dashboard to track specifically the metrics we wanted to track. We were able to create a dashboard in the back office version of this application, accessible only to developers and administrators, that could track the usage of every user, how often they were using it, whether they used it on each policy, whether or not they got declined or approved, and we could tie their behavior in aggregate back to our KPIs so we can understand, are they adopting it? And once they are adopting it, is this actually making a difference in the KPIs that are necessary? So we could track our decline rate over time. And before we get into specifically how it affected the business. I want to show you a demonstration of the tool. But if you're not tracking these KPIs, if you're not understanding where you were and measuring where you are building an application without really caring too much if it's making a difference. So the ability to create a custom dashboard like this was also instrumental in us understanding whether or not we were making a difference and being able to tie back these KPIs to dollars. So let's quickly go into a demo of the tool, and then Phil will talk about specifically how it's affected the business. So this is the first screen of the pre-screen assessment, where we gather some demographic and health metrics. Let's say that our agent is working with a client that is a female from Alabama who's 55 years old, 5'5", and 230 pounds. It'll move us to the health history section where we answer some preliminary questions about the client's health. Notice that we have 6 debit points accrued already. That's due to the height and weight combination that we already provided. First question asks if we're smoking, if we have smoked in the past. Let's say we're currently smoking. It generated a new question because we only want to ask the questions that are necessary. Let's answer the rest of these correctly so we don't get filtered out. We'll move forward. And now we're moved to the medication screen where we ask what medications is the client currently taking. Let's say that they're taking Acupril. We'll select that and move forward. We'll answer some contextual questions about Acupril, namely, why are we taking it? Let's say we're taking it for high blood pressure. This will move us to the conditions section where we attest what conditions does the client already have. Notice that high blood pressure is already attested to. Let's add osteoarthritis to that. We'll move forward and have to answer some contextual questions about the conditions that we attested to. It wants to know if the proposed insured has had a blood pressure of 160/90 or less for 3 months. Let's say yes, but for less than 3 months. For osteoarthritis, it wants to know if any of the following apply. We'll say no. We'll answer a couple of these follow-up questions. And let's say surgery has been recommended and performed. No other questions have been generated, so we can move forward. With these specific answers to these specific questions, we'll notice that we are likely not insurable. If we click on the debit point counter up here, we'll see each reason why we had accrued up to 9 debit points. And below, you'll see a table that tells us how many debit points we can have before we get declined. Once we get to 9, once we get to 9 debit points, we know we'll be declined. If you expand that, you'll notice that there's other considerations, meaning that even if we took care of some of these debit points up here, we would still have to have a blood pressure of 160/90 or less for more than 3 months in order for them to be approved for a policy. So let's say it's a couple of months later. Let's say they have been stable at 160/90 or less. And let's say there are no medications and no residual impairment for the second question. Notice that third question disappeared. We move forward, and due to these questions, we are now likely insurable because we only have 8 debit points associated with them. In addition, if we expand that table, we'll notice that at 8 debit points, we have a standard rating classification at 200% ratio to standard, which should set some expectations for the client as to what might happen in the underwriting process. This is a highly detailed assessment and assessment of their insurability that should give them some understanding of what might happen in the future.
All right, so that was the demo of the tool. Lastly, I'm going to hand it off to Phil to talk a little bit about how the tool has affected the business, and then we'll see you later. Phil?
Thanks, Dan. Great job. And now my favorite thing to talk about, which is the financial impact to this. So what we did is we took a slice of year-over-year comparisons between June and July. And initially, Dane talked a little bit about pre-screen and how 1% decrease in the decline rate would basically pay for the development cost, and upwards of 10% was kind of our target, which would be, some fractional portion of, between $1 and $2 million. So when we look at, now what's difficult about this is there's so many characteristics of it. It's not a straight linear kind of approach. There's, the amount of submissions plus pandemic and, changes to underwriting rules, things like that. Everything plays kind of a factor into that. But on an average basis, weighted average basis, we determined, 1% equated to about $125,000. So when we look year over year, we had a 2% decrease in the month of June, going from 32.9 to 30.9%. So, roughly that's about $250,000 of savings. And then when you look at July, going from 34.9 to 28.8, It's about 6.1% decrease. So a significant savings, was kind of attained. Now these are the percentages, and because of those variables, it's a little misleading. But when we look at the actual number of submissions or the number of apps, the raw savings was about $500,000 in that time frame. So quite a compelling story when we look at how this enables our agents and it reduces our OpEx footprint. It's a pretty compelling story for New York Life. All right, Dane, send it back to you.
Thanks, Phil.
We hope that you guys feel a little bit more enabled to be a little bit bolder with your OutSystems use, utilize that sense of digital enablement, and provide a little bit bigger of a difference back at your organizations. So I appreciate you guys joining us today, and I hope to see you next year when we have OutSystems Next Step in person. Thanks.